Biology 11, how you doing? This moves us into topic 14. We're going to look at phylum Chordata. So kingdom Animalia, basically things that eat other things and are multicellular. And we'll move into a large group called the Chordates. Up until this point, we've been studying things that were considered to be invertebrates, insects, mollusks, etc. Now as we move into this group, we're going to look at critters that have a supportive rod up their spine, and it's located very close to their spinal column. Now, in more advanced versions of the chordates, you get bone on top of that, which begins to protect the spinal column. And that was a very smart evolution. Also helped a lot of critters stand up on land, very useful in the water as well. But we'll see some critters in this primitive phylum, this large group called Chordata, that don't even have that bone. And in fact, that didn't evolve right away. The chordates that you would know best would be fish, amphibians, birds, reptiles, mammals, things like that. And they have a strong supportive vertebral column, which you're used to. But the chordates are an even bigger group. All you have to do to be in phylum Chordata is to have 4 principal characteristics. Most notable is a stiff rod called a notochord that goes up the back. Now there's other characteristics that we'll look at here, but let's start with that stiff rod going up the back, and we'll just move our way from there, okay? All right, so here we go. Moving on. So a chordate obviously belongs to a very large group, phylum Chordata, and there's 4 basic characteristics, 4 things that you should be able to identify that you would know that put you in the camp of chordates. So let's go to my pen tool here. I'll switch. It's already dark enough as it is. There we go. You have to have, number 1, a dorsal hollow nerve cord. Okay, so we have that. So do fish. So do birds, amphibians, reptiles. It's a spot for your spinal tissue, right? Your spinal cord to go along. Secondly, you have to have what's called a notochord. Now a notochord, the distinction that I would make there is that a notochord isn't made of bone. It's a really hard piece of cartilage, and you see this fiber cartilage that runs up the back, and it provided a lot of support along the basically along the dorsal surface for the earliest, what we would call sort of protochordates. Now we're much more evolved. We ended up getting bone down the backbone, bone down our back as well. But in the beginning, there was just a notochord. And when you look at some fish, and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. If you look at something like a hagfish, or a lamprey for that matter, these little guys here don't have a backbone. In fact, they're very flexible. These guys hang out on the bottom of the ocean, and they don't even have primitive jaws, but they do have a stiff rod going all the way down their back, and that can be pulled out in these guys. In fact, in lamprey, which is very similar, sort of like our first fish here, there we go. These little guys that land on fish and more or less drink their tissues, they don't have a backbone. They have a very simple notochord that goes up the back, and if you've never seen lamprey, they've got that little rasping tongue, and they kind of hang on with their suction-like mouth. This is a very, very early fish. Lamprey can actually be consumed. They're considered to be important to several indigenous tribes, particularly down by Kinney Dam, if you know about the Columbia River area down there in northeast Washington. But I digress. We've got to get back to our information. So they have to have a notochord. The next thing that they have to have are what are called pharyngeal pouches. Now that is a structure that in us ceases to exist after embryonic development. It would be about where a fish would have its gills. Now in development, we have these little pouches, which I'll show you in a minute, and it looks for a brief period of time that we have gills. but we have a lot of DNA in common with several of our ancestors, including DNA that would have, could have, but didn't produce gills in us. But you do see us go through the stages as if we're going to have gill development. So pharyngeal pouches, the stiff rod, the notochord that goes up your back, and a hollow nerve cord. The last thing that you have to have is a tail that goes past the anus. Now you would probably say, wait a minute, I don't have a tail. Well, think about it for a moment. You do have a tailbone, and it's just that our legs grew longer as we began to develop. At one point, we had a tail that extended past the anus quite handily. So those are the 4 characteristics that you need to know about. Okay. Let's see here. I'm going to skip to this slide for a minute because it points out all 4, and I'll come back in a moment to the previous slide. So here's our notochord right here. And the notochord, interestingly enough, you would think this is a bizarre position for it. This rod right here, this notochord, is really, like I say, sort of hard but yet flexible cartilage, right? Think of it as the material like between the between your vertebrae, like the discs between your vertebrae. Very hard, very structural, quite important. Now, in us, we would expect to protect our nerve cord here by encasing it in bone. In this case, the notochord's a little bit ventral to the nerve cord, so that a lot of students are sort of surprised by that. They would expect that the notochord was more towards the dorsal surface, but it's actually a little bit under the nerve cord. The notochord provides a lot of strength. If you look at fish, if you've ever eaten salmon, and most of us have, except for those of us, I guess, who are a bit allergic to that, the notochord itself provides a very strong foundation for the muscles to pull on. So that's one of its advantages. So we've got our notochord, we've got our dorsal hollow nerve cord, and here are our pharyngeal pouches, which I'll point out here. Now, this becomes gill tissue in things like fish. In us, it just becomes part of the structure of our jaw. The tail goes past the anus, so we call it a postanal tail. And there you go, because here's the anus right here. So all 4 characteristics, 1, 2, 3, and 4 are here. So I know what you're thinking. Thinking on something that develops like us, do we have these characteristics? In fact, we do. Just pop out for one quick second. If you look at, there we go. Let's keep it to a human embryo. When you look at human embryos, you can see that, let's go to images here for a second. There we go. This picture exemplifies it fairly darn well. If you look just underneath the eye, you'll see those pouches. Let's see if I can borrow this picture here. Save image. I'll pop out to my images just for a second. Let's see if I can call that up. Photos. There we go. Okay. Actually, folks, well, you know what I think I'll do? I think I'll just point it out in the picture. It's a little bit easier, but let's set up a new one here. Import image from the photo library. Ah, there we go. Awesome. All right, so here we go. So if you look at a human embryo like this, now I can annotate it a little bit. There we go. All right. So this is the gill pouch material here. And the notochord becomes sort of one with our vertebral development here, and our dorsal hollow CNS is found inside of the tube. There's a nerve tube in there, in which you'll find your nervous tissue. The anus is here, and the postanal tail is exactly what it says it is, right there. So I wanted to show you, even with a human embryo, that that's the case. Okay, so thanks for bearing with me. Back up one here for a second. This is important because all four of these characteristics show up in this thing called a lancet. Now, it's what I like to call a protofish. Lancets are very, very primitive. They gave rise, or something like their ancestor, gave rise to the first really crude fish, the lampreys and the hagfish. And if we look carefully here, what we'll see are the notochord, right there, dorsal hollow nerve cord, pharyngeal gill slits, there you go, and that post-anal tail. So all four characteristics. Now, in the lancet fish, these persist even in the adult. To be a chordate doesn't mean that you have to have all four characteristics throughout your whole life cycle. You just had to show the characteristics at some point, like the post-anal tail in humans. It doesn't really show up with us all that often. Okay, so they go over each of the characteristics here. So the notochord, pointed out as being right there. So we've kind of spoken to this. I usually do when I get going. Okay. And it is just below the nerve cord. Pharyngeal pouches, we now know about them. There they are. And a lot of people forget what your pharynx region is, so I'll describe it this way. It's at the back of the throat. So if you're having a really thick milkshake and you're sucking really hard to get the milkshake in, and it gets sore in the back of your throat, those are your pharyngeal muscles in your pharynx region that are feeling quite sore. And if we go back to an earthworm has a very strongly developed pharynx, and when we dissected it, you saw all that muscle around the pharyngeal region. It's just that the pharynx region eventually becomes a place where gills persist or develop in fish. Okay, there's the post-anal tail. And the tail can contain bone, but it doesn't have to, and it's often used for swimming. On land, a tail becomes a nice counterbalance. Cats primarily rely on their tails for that special counterbalance when they're leaping, when they're crawling along the fence. It really helps them to hold their balance. In us, if you've ever seen someone do tightrope walking and they hold that pole, think of that as a momentary balancing item like a tail. So here we go. When we look at chordates, 96% of them are vertebrates. So there's a really small group, like less than 1 in 20, that don't have vertebra or a vertebral column to protect the spinal tissue. And it really if you stop and think about this, it makes a lot of sense because that spinal cord needed to be protected. And it was obviously an advantage for that material to develop. So, you might say, well, what happened to our notochord? As we develop, it just fuses. It just kind of becomes one with the developing tissue, and then it's largely gone. It is there when we first develop, but then once the vertebral column comes in, it's pretty well it for your notochord. Phylogeny of chordates. What do they mean by phylogeny? Let's kind of look at that and think of evolution. What developed from what? You have to go back to the mark where people mistakenly think that one thing turns into another. And that's not always the case. Some of these old critters are still around, which begs you to sort of ponder, well, if they're still around, then, how did I come into being? If you think about Lamarck, what is wrong with Lamarckian thinking is that, there goes my phone right in the middle of one of my lectures. It's okay. I'll keep going. In Lamarckian thinking, what happens is one organism acquires characteristics in its lifetime and moves on to become another. And that kind of thinking isn't in line with evolutionary thinking. In evolution, there are different versions of different critters. I like to think of them as test mutants. Some have the characteristics to move on, and others don't have the characteristics to survive. If the characteristics that show up in evolution, just through chance, are positive, then that animal has an advantage and is able to adapt in its environment. Maybe it can assume camouflage. Maybe it's protected from its enemies. Maybe it's able to propagate, have more babies in the wild. So, at any rate, when you look at the evolution of critters, there's lots of test circumstances that come up, and only some have what it takes to survive in the environment. I guess if we go back and we think of giraffes with the long necks being able to reach up high, there you go. So, in the phylogeny of chordates, if we kind of stack it up, we're not saying one thing turned into another. We're just looking at the stacking order. I'll switch up here. Let's go with a darker blue this time. There was something probably like our lancet, our invertebrate ancestor, that gave rise to things like our lancet. Now, our lancet would be essentially a jawless fish going along this line here. Now, there's some pretty interesting critters when you look at them. We know that the animals were developing from invertebrates, so it's not surprising to see your sharks, skates and rays, and your lampreys and your hagfish here before you see the bony fish. I know who's trying to get hold of me. It's my wife. She wants to meet me for lunch. I'll call her back in just a second. Then we see our fish, and then the evolutionary pattern that we expected becoming much more complex. Something that was fish-like was able to come up out of water. If you've ever seen mud skippers, for example, they can come up out of water. There's a lot of fish that can do that. And that gave rise to something, a variation of fish gave rise to amphibians. A variation of amphibians that had a watertight body, scales, claws, etc., gave rise to our reptiles. We know that there's a very strong link between reptiles and birds. If you've ever seen the fossil Archaeopteryx, it's a reptile with feathers. So a pretty interesting little critter. And what a lot of people aren't aware of is that a variation of a reptile with hair and the ability to heat its body eventually gave rise to the mammals. And the first mammals were sort of rodent-like. Okay, so I intentionally left this guy out because it's so weird looking. It's called, it's a non-vertebrate chordate. And we said that there were 96% of these critters didn't have a backbone. Well, let's look at this weird little critter. And it's called a tunica. And I left it out intentionally. Just a sec here. Try not to make you dizzy. Not there, not there, not there. Where's my friend the tunicate? He's not there. I know why, because I left him on my computer to show you. Okay, so popping out and taking a look at the tunicate. Okay, so I'll just pop out of my coursework here. There we go. Now, tunicates themselves they kind of look like sponges. So let's take a little tour. You would look at this and think, oh, hey, I'm looking at a sponge. And you'd say, oh, quite nice looking. Now, they're filter feeders, and they feed the way a sponge does. And at first glance, you wouldn't realize that these are very closely related to us. They kind of look like these weird brain sponges with this interesting well, they're hardly symmetrical. That one looks like a heart. Now let's go inside of a tunicate and see what is there. Their bodies, zoom in, are comprised basically of an in siphon and an out siphon. And you'll see that they have a primitive digestive system. So they filter feed. They're able to respire through these gill slits. And then they have a primitive digestive system where they do their absorbing and release their waste products. So tunicates are pretty plain Jane and simple. I'll zoom out here. Here's another nice example. There you go. And that's the tunicate on the right. And here's all the information you could see. Like I say, it just reminds me of a sponge. It's got nervous tissue, gonads, basic the digestive system. It's a primitive heart over here. It has a notochord, just like we do. In fact, here's the tunicate as it's developing, when it's kind of a baby tunicate, and there's that notochord, and there's that tail right there. So if you think back to that primitive fish that we looked at a little while ago, they're extremely similar. Interesting that this critter's still around, but because it can feed and reproduce and survive, it just keeps persisting. It's a very, very ancient ancestor of ours. Okay. I'm just going to have to pause and take this phone call. Okay, I took that phone call. My wife really wanted to go for lunch here today. By the way, today is the 24th of July. So I decided I wanted to get this final screencast done and out to you guys because it's one of the last ones I hadn't done. But anyways, here's our phylogenetic tree. And what's neat about this, in a cladogram type way, what it shows is how things developed. So we know that things like hair and mammary glands, they're really new and they're specific just to mammals. They kind of separate us. Just like feathers are kind of avian and a little bit reptilian, if you think about Archaeopteryx. This is that's the amnion, or the amniotic sac. We were born in one, and you see it in the eggs of reptiles and birds. But you don't see it in amphibians. So as you go back and we have these common but more characteristic features, we realize that vertebrae are really old, and then jaws developed, lungs burst onto the scene. We start to see that amongst fewer and fewer organisms. Limbs, now that's fewer organisms because you're only really seeing that with your land-based critters until we get to these highly specific items, feathers, mammary glands, hair. So remember how a cladogram works. If it's a characteristic that's common to a great number of things, it's really old because we all have it. But if it's a characteristic like this and this, which is relatively new, well, in evolution that showed up just a little while ago. And it helps us to separate critters. And in fact, we can look at the evolution of characteristics and in a way that helps us to sort animals in this giant sort of library that we call biology. There's a neat little animation on the website here going over the 4 characteristics of chordates. Make sure you review it. Make sure you know it. I won't run through it now, but you get an idea. And for your viewing pleasure on the site, there we go. I'll have I'm just filling in the lesson here now. The notes that go with it will be here. Things for you to fill in if that's what you want to do. Okay. 4 characteristics of chordates. So here's your animation. Nice little brain pop here, one of their free ones. This is neat. If you have a chance, look at the big picture of animal evolution. This goes into quite a bit of detail, even more than I did. And a neat video on those crazy little tunicates, those little things that look like sponge hearts down in the ocean. Okay, well, I'm going to leave it at that. Sorry about my phone ringing in the middle of my lesson, but sometimes things happen. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, have a good one. Mr. B out.